ロラン様が目指す通り、ノゼリアの民に平等と安寧をもたらしましょう。ベネディクトが望むウォルホートの威信と未来も守ろう。フレデリカの望むローゼル族の解放も果たします。困難極まる道だが、我々の力を合わせれば不可能ではないはずだ。私の選んだ道に異論のある者はいるか。
As a heads up, I'm going to be spoiling Triangle Strategy's entire story in this one, so if you haven't played Triangle Strategy yet and are curious as to how it is both gameplay and story-wise without spoilers, I did a more general overview of the game right here, so feel free to check that out, link at the top right. Think of this as a spoiler section add-on to that video. I'll also give a quick run over of the basic plot before jumping to all the spoiler bits to make sure everyone's on the same page, so if what I said sounds interesting, you've got time to hop out before I start revealing all the fun bits of how the story turns out. So here's the basic setup. Again, if you watched my other video or played the game, this is going to sound mighty familiar, but bear with me. Triangle Strategy takes place on the continent of Norzelia, which is run by 3 distinct nations. The Kingdom of Glenbrook, which is situated on the Norzelia River, bringing trade to all 3 nations. The Grand Duchy of Esfrost, which has a ton of iron mines. And the Holy State of Hyzant, which is home to a lake, which also happens to be the only source of salt on the continent. Due to each nation monopolizing a different resource, a huge war called the aptly named Salt Iron War took place, each nation trying to take control of the other's resources. After all 3 nations were on the brink of destruction, they finally decided to broker a truce. 30 years later, a new alliance is about to be born between these 3 nations. The main character for our story is Serenoa Wolfort, the budding young master of the Wolfort domain. The Wolfort family is second only to the royal family of Glenbrook thanks to the efforts of the current head of the house, Simone Wolfort, during the Salt Iron War. In a gesture of friendship between the nations, Esfrost has sent Frederica Esfrost to be wed to Serenoa, and that is pretty much where our story begins. What Triangle Strategy really excels in is creating a sense of mystery for the player. Not as in what happened, who's behind the invasion, or who is truly in control. All of those things are surprisingly pretty obvious from the get-go. I'm sure most of you here watching can probably guess those things within the first 4 hours of the game, which you will shortly see. No, the true mystery of Triangle Strategy is how on earth is Serenoa and his friends gonna be able to bring peace back to Norzelia when it seems as if the entire world and everyone is against them. Triangle Strategy does a great job of establishing each of the 3 countries that make up Norzelia: Glenbrook, Esfrost, and Hyzant. And when you clearly see how many problems every single one of these nations face, it makes the prospect of changing Norzelia for the better begin to seem more and more like an impossible task. What seems to be a quaint story about a fallen righteous nation fighting back against an evil empire gets very complicated very fast because there is another nation that is equally as strong as the evil empire, and the fallen kingdom that our main characters call home is also full of its own share of issues. The very beginning of the game starts pretty much on the day of the alliance between nations, 30 years after the big war that threatened to end the continent as they knew it. We get introduced to all 3 of the nations on this auspicious day, and the first thing you'll probably notice incredibly fast is that, wow, do a lot of the people look either incredibly suspicious or downright evil. Everyone in House Wolfort, all super nice looking people. The Glenbrook royal family, affable enough, even if Prince Fanny kinda acts like a royal dick to the second prince, insinuating that Prince Roland is an idiot for being friends with Serenoa. Maxwell the Dawnbringer looks like the righteous protector of good, and Avlora looks serious if nothing else. Every single other character, literally 2 steps away from twirling their mustaches. Patriot is the Prime Minister of Glenbrook, and look at this guy. He fits the sleazy Prime Minister stereotype to a T. Hyzant introduces themselves as a religious country of peace and equality, representing themselves with ex-Head Marshal and Minister Sorceley. One of these guys looks like a young upstart who's looking down at everybody, and the other guy looks like a greedy Robotnik. You think this guy has the people's best interest in mind? This guy? And then there's Esfrost, which is represented by Erica, Thalis, Dragon, and Gustadolf. Erica and Thalis introduce themselves by being incredible assholes towards their sister, Frederica, and berating the country of Glenbrook at every point. They also look like this. Dragon is an ambitious guy who clearly has something nefarious planned. And then there's Gustadolf, who is the definition of an emperor of an evil empire. None of these influential figures look like they are out for anything but themselves. It's almost comical how brazenly evil everybody is. In a way though, all of this is set up for the upcoming desperate situation House Wolfort is about to face. After everyone agrees to help in the newly discovered mines, Serenoa and the group are tasked to act as ambassadors and escorts to one of the two rival nations, Hyzant or Esfrost, on behalf of Glenbrook since Simone Wolfort is sick. Regardless of whichever side you picked, you'll end up seeing obvious glaring issues in either country. In Hyzant, Serenoa learns about the Holy City where everyone lives in peace and harmony, except for the fact that they are showing some blatant racism towards the Roselles, and consequently, Frederica. The church clearly has way too much power and are incredibly secretive of all the knowledge they hold, branding those who dare run away as heretics to be hunted. The Hierophant also never speaks directly, but rather goes through a proxy who is one of the Saintly Seven, which is such a classic fishy situation that everyone goes, huh, I wonder what's going on here. In Esfrost, you'll see a whole different issue where Gustadolf talks about how important freedom and liberty is to their people, yet plenty of citizens in his nation face extreme poverty due to this survival of the fittest mentality. Either way, Dragon discovers something in the mining venture that he tries to hide from everybody else, but is forced to cooperate with Serenoa once the Esfrost soldiers attack the mine. Stuff happens, Dragon dies, and Esfrost then invades Glenbrook on the premise that Dragon was killed due to Glenbrook trying to monopolize these mines. On your way back to save the king, you find out that you are pretty much too late as Gustadolf has already killed his way to the throne room. Serenoa attempts to reveal the truth but is kept silent by Benedict, and they are forced to escape with Prince Roland, whereupon Prince Franny is killed, King Regna and Cordelia are taken captive, and Sir Maxwell is totally dead, yeah, for sure, 100%. What I really like about this part is that there are a couple things established here. First off, Triangle Strategy isn't afraid to kill people in the story. Prince Franny dying like this is actually pretty surprising. I thought they would use him as a puppet figure, but nope. Avlora just straight ends his life. Secondly, while the main character could have yelled out the truth he saw, Benedict, and consequently the game itself, is smart enough to realize that Serenoa's words would do absolutely nothing in that situation. Without proof, who are people going to trust? The supposed right hand of the murderer or the king of Esfrost? Especially considering that during the invasion, Gustadolf left the civilians out on purpose to gain their trust. Third, this is pretty much the final setup for the rest of the story to play out. By establishing all the clear villainous characters in every country, and eliminating every character that was remotely good, it puts Serenoa and House Wolfort in the precarious position where they have no true allies to rely upon anymore. While it's not surprising that King Regna, Maxwell, and Simone all bite the dust here, as they are all the pillars of Glenbrook and therefore need to be ousted from the story so that our main characters can have some real conflict. It's a dash of added realism spoken by Benedict and the blatant evilness of the rest of the cast that really lets the player know, oh snap, Prince Roland and House Wolfort are in a very bad place. At this point, after retreating back to the Wolfort domain, King Regna is publicly executed after admitting to the lies about him killing Dragon to the public. Why he would do this? Probably in a bid to protect his remaining children, Cordelia and Roland. The public eat these lies up as Esfrost and their invasion pretty much left the civilians completely untouched, so they don't have any particularly harsh feelings towards them. This is where the story starts to branch quite a bit depending on the decisions you make, but also, more importantly, I think I highlighted enough for you to figure out whether you are intrigued enough about Triangle Strategy to want to discover the rest yourself. If you are, and are wondering about the gameplay portion, my other video is in the top right still in case you want more information on that front. For those sticking around, let's continue onwards. One of the greatest strengths of Triangle Strategy is how much weight the subsequent decisions are given because of the sheer desperation that House Wolfort faces. Even though we as the player will pick what we consider is right, I like that I can understand the viewpoint of the other side, of why other characters would even consider a different option. Having to talk to and convince each of the characters to change their stance really helps us understand what their thought process is. It gives certain characters a lot more development which they otherwise wouldn't have, and which will ultimately build up into the final route split. Using the next decision as an example, right after King Regna's execution, S-Frost offers House Wolford an ultimatum. Either surrender Prince Roland so that they have full control of the royal family, or they're gonna raise the entire Wolford domain. This brings up the next scales of conviction vote of whether we surrender Roland or not. Frederica voting against it shows her idealism. We shouldn't sacrifice our friends regardless of danger. Benedict voting for it shows his priority in keeping House Wolford safe against a force they have next to no chance in winning. But it is Roland's vote here that is most important, because Roland is voting to surrender himself. It reveals a ton of things about Roland's character. The obvious one is that he doesn't want to drag his best friend Serenoa into a nigh unwinnable fight, and doesn't want other people sacrificing themselves for him, but it also shows his lack of confidence in himself. After being told by his brother and even his father all his life that he doesn't have the makings of a king, Roland himself truly doesn't feel like he is right for the role which he must now fight for if Glenbrook is to have any future. Roland is a good guy who cares a lot about his countrymen and strives to protect the justice he himself believes in, but he is also held back by all of his doubts and fears. Is putting those he cares about in danger to try and reclaim a role he was never meant for even worth it? Isn't sacrificing his citizens to try and help his citizens completely backwards? It is those very same fears that lead Roland into pushing for his own surrender. Assuming we didn't surrender Roland, we now have to fight Avlora and the S-Frost army with our Scorched Earth tactics. Except we don't, because we want the golden ending, and using those tactics would lock us out of it, making this fight absolutely terrible. Through some divine miracle of cheesing the crap out of her, we beat them off. Roland sees this terrible battle as just a small example of how his fight with S-Frost is gonna ruin a lot of citizens' lives, which would probably be a bigger statement if we actually did set fire to our domain, but we fought them off without it. Nonetheless, it makes him even more depressed. One of the other higher nobles at this point, Silvio Tellior, offers an alliance where he plans on housing Roland against the S-Frost army, but considering he looks like this, and everyone kind of universally agrees that he pretty much left the royal family to die, House Wolford rejects his proposal in one of the easiest votes in the entire story. Fighting him off after he reveals his obvious true colors, Roland and House Wolford then proceed to pull off a daring plan where they fake Roland's death, which aside from tricking Gustadolf, also has the byproduct of plunging Cordelia into pure despair, as she believes her entire family is dead now. Cordelia then announces her wedding to Gustadolf, which is obviously a plan to control Glenbrook with Cordelia as a puppet ruler. This then opens up our first big golden ending decision that I think gameplay-wise is kinda dumb, but as a story function is pretty dang smart. Essentially, Sorcery, as one of the ministers of Hyzant, has been sending aid to House Wolford, which all the main characters know that he's only doing so he can force them into his debt, but are forced to take it anyways because otherwise their citizens would starve. Well, Sorcery has come to make good on that debt by forcing House Wolford to help out with his illegal salt smuggling, which, considering Hyzant is a state religion revolving around the salt as a holy gift from the goddess, is pretty much one of the highest crimes possible. The upcoming decision is simple. Does House Wolford agree to transport the salt, or try to report Sorcery to Hyzant? Gameplay-wise, this decision is incredibly annoying because the game heavily favors reporting the salt, as the default decision ends on that side. And the requirement to convince anyone to the other side is probably the hardest decision in the entire game. Even with optimal information, I was unable to convince Anna, the only undecided member, until I farmed for about 2 hours in mock battles. What's strange is that every subsequent voting for the entire rest of the game was pretty much a done deal. So either the requirement for this one vote is stupid high for no good reason, or I just so happen to have terrible conviction stats for this one vote. As a story function, however, I think it's a really good decision. It shows House Wolford at their lowest, where they have to stoop to smuggling salt illegally for a terrible person. Everyone kinda agrees that doing so will lead to a lot of problems, but the alternative of trying to report him also isn't a done deal. Just like with the Gustadolf situation, who is Hyzant gonna believe? One of the 7 saintly ministers that control the entire country, or some guy who is in the process of transporting salt illegally? Without some sort of hardline proof which Serenoa doesn't have, I doubt that anyone is gonna believe House Wolford. As a player, this is probably one of the hardest decisions in the entire game to make, as you aren't given enough information, nor do you really have a strong leaning on which side is more correct from a moral standpoint. Not participating in a crime would be the general good thing to do, as indicated by Frederica's and Eridor's opinion, but the problem is that we've already seen the Hyzant top brass multiple times by now, And we know that the religious state has some big skeletons in the closet. If the implied human experimentation and prevalent Roselle racism wasn't already indicative enough. By transporting the salt, perhaps we can receive more information regarding how this operation is run, thereby getting evidence that way. Both votes have some very obvious merits and demerits, both of which could be argued for either side, even if you tried to bring morality into the sentiment. In a different setting, it would probably be a done deal, but thanks to Triangle Strategy setting up everyone to be so blatantly evil, the right decision suddenly starts to look a lot grayer. Anyhow, I'm gonna start spinning up a bit, since if I keep going at this pace, this story overview will end up being over an hour long, so... Assuming we're following golden ending requirements, Sarah Noah decides to transport salt to S-Frost, which allows Roland to meet up with the surprise recipient of the salt, Savrog, Dragon's father and second most powerful man in S-Frost. At this point, Sarah Noah makes a decision on whether to reveal the secret of Roland's death in order to gain his trust or to not, which is honestly a really easy decision compared to the last one, considering the fact that we literally have no allies, and Savrog has been the first person in this entire game who actually looks worthy of our trust. After taking out the spy that tries to reveal all of this to Gustadolf, Roland and Savrog form an alliance to get the revenge on Gustadolf. Roland for his family, Gustadolf for his son, Dragon. On the return back, Sarah Noah and House Wolfort are called to Hyzant as they are in trouble since they helped Sorceley in transporting the salt. Sorceley is killed off, and Sarah Noah is given another choice: join the Saintly Seven, but give up the Roselle fugitives living in the Wolfort domain, or get branded as heretics. Defending the Roselle is the righteous decision. If it wasn't already immediately obvious from the implied racism, you get shown Roselles who are literally working in the salt mines until they die. The only question here is whether you are willing to abandon them in order to protect the Wolfort domain or not. As we don't want to be seen as heartless villains, Sarah Noah decides to protect the Roselle, leading to a battle against Silvio once again, who has been secretly hired by Hyzant to force Sarah Noah's hand. After beating Silvio's forces, we learn that Hyzant now knows of our decision and are sending their entire army to remove the Roselle by force. Luckily, we also learn about a key that Frederica's mom, who turns out to be the revolutionary leader who tried to free all the Roselle years ago, hid in the refugee village, which was supposedly revealed to church to be a complete lie. At this point, you are put in an exploration phase, except this time, unlike the others, we are given a clear goal of trying to find this supposed key to use as a weapon against Hyzant. I do really like this portion of the game in that I think it's an excellent use of the exploration phase, but as far as I know, they only do this twice, with this being one of them. Anyways, after searching under the elder's household while he's distracted, you find a salt crystal which proves that Hyzant's entire religion is a lie, as salt isn't a gift from the goddess. It exists in other places as well. Using this as leverage, Sarah Noah manages to convince Hyzant to not bother with the Roselle living in the Wolfort domain, and still aid them in retaking back Glenbrook from S-Frost, as it would be in Hyzant's best interest if they got Glenbrook in their depth, or at the very least, away from S-Frosty control. Holding up a now revealed Roland as a cause for justice with one giant bomb in hand, all that's left is deciding how you want to retake back the kingdom, which brings us to the first three-way decision in the game, as well as a clear representation of each of the three route leaders' mindsets. Before I get into that, however, I wanted to talk a bit about Cordelia and Avlora. While we have been mostly focusing on the exploits of House Wolfort, I do think Triangle Strategy does an excellent job covering all sides of the war, and that includes Cordelia. After witnessing the supposed death of her entire family, Cordelia still attempts to make her stand as the last surviving member of the Glenbrook royal family, which is amazing considering how bad of a situation she is in. If House Wolfort is a battle of desperation, Cordelia's situation is one where she has basically already lost. Her struggle to overcome nigh impossible odds wins over Avlora to her side, as Avlora sees a ton of herself from the past within Cordelia. While it would be entirely reasonable for her to give up considering she's basically a puppet ruler, she still uses her position to try and find any little bit of information or advantage she can possibly exploit. Now, the reason why I haven't really talked about them much is that I think this whole dynamic is kinda dropped after the whole retake Glenbrook part of the game. Cordelia barely shows up in the golden ending as she's only recruitable on Roland's route, and Avlora pretty much gets side character treatment, which is a tad bit strange considering that's the only route you get her in. It's kind of a shame since the game devotes a pretty healthy amount of time developing their relationship, and it's probably one of the more interesting ones in the game. Anyways, getting back to the revolution at Glenbrook, like always, all three of the methods to retaking the kingdom presented by Benedict, Frederica, and Roland each have their own share of issues. Benedict suggests using the bomb to break the dam, flooding the entire town. It would probably guarantee the safest invasion, but it would also cause a lot of civilian casualties and ruin one of the vital resources that the kingdom runs on. It's the safest, but also the most heartless and costly method at the same time. Then we have the exact opposite spectrum, where Frederica suggests bombing the bridge and forcing Frost into negotiations so that the least number of people would have to die. On one hand, it would be super nice if it worked. On the other hand, there is absolutely no guarantee that Frost would even agree to surrender. Any of the people remaining in the palace could be used as a hostage, like Cordelia. When I heard of Frederica's suggestion, I was like, she out of her mind. Lastly, we have Roland, who's just infiltrating the castle and assassinating all the commanding officers after bombing their escape battleship, which would be the fastest way to end a battle, but would instantly fail if Cordelia had already revealed all the secret passages. Personally, I chose Roland's plan since I felt like Benedict's plan was too extreme, and Frederica's plan was probably not gonna work. Regardless of whichever method you choose, Saranoa and friends beat Erica, Thalis, and Avlora, and take back Glenbrook after 2 climactic battles. On a side note, Avlora was an absolute unit during Roland's path, which made for a legitimately cool boss battle. I laughed when Roland was like, "Fight me, Avlora," right before Avlora nearly one-shot him. Cordelia at this point attempts to try and convince Roland not to kill Avlora, but he is not one to be swayed. At the very least, instead of just executing her, he decides to settle it in a duel at the exact same bridge that Sir Maxwell was felled. Thankfully, we have cutscene powers, so Roland manages to prevail and Avlora falls from the bridge heavily injured, vanishing from the plot, which is honestly a little weird considering how much time was devoted to the Cordelia and Avlora relationship, but I guess he thought she'd be too strong or something. It's understandable that someone needed to take the responsibility for the takeover of Glenbrook, but that could have been Erica and Thalis, and it's not like we even have Avlora's body in all 3 routes as she vanishes. After all of this, we have finally reached the third and final act of the game. With the kingdom taken back and Frosty soldiers removed from the capital, normally this would be the ending point for most other stories. Triangle Strategy, however, reveals a much different aftermath than one would expect from such a setup. Rather than happy at the return of their king, Roland is instead met with apathy and suspicion from his citizens. Glenbrook has just seen their king admit to terrible crimes, his daughter saying that she would right his wrongs and then doing nothing, and finally Roland, this upstart who only managed to take the capital back thanks to the help from House Wolfort and Hyzant. What's worse is that, thanks to Frost's freedom policies, the citizens of Glenbrook find their return back to noble first rules very antiquated and quite terrible. To top it all off, the high nobles who all submitted to Gustadolf when he was there all come crawling back, and the first thing they do upon their king's return is steal all the relief funds he tried to give to his citizens. None of this is any surprise, considering what we've seen of the nobles' actions thus far, and even aside from the obvious villainy of Patriette and Silvio, we were also warned about this from Prince Franny way back in the beginning. What should have been a triumphant moment for Roland is instead a huge slap to the face, as he is led to feel as if all the efforts and sacrifice he made for his country amounted to absolutely nothing. The countrymen whom he tried his hardest to save don't even really want him there, and the kingdom his family has protected all these generations has long been rotting thanks to how corrupt the upper nobles are. On the other end, Saranoa finds himself in an incredibly precarious situation as members of every kingdom seek to poach House Wolfort for their own ends. The only bright light to come at the end of all of this is that Simon Wolfort has woken up from his coma. At this point, the group decides to split into 3 different ways. Benedict goes back to visit Lord Simon as he's just awakened, Roland is gonna try and handle the corrupt nobles, and Frederica is gonna go to the Roselle refugee village to defend them from bandits. For the golden ending, we're gotta visit Lord Simon one last time, as you probably realize that Simon doesn't actually have very long to live. I will, however, quickly talk about all 3 choices since it's basically explained afterwards. If you decide to go with Roland, you see Patriette harassing the heck out of civilians, whereupon Roland decides to just straight up exile all the nobles. This goes about as well as you imagine it to, in the sense that they want revenge and try to murder the king in the middle of town. Even after beating them, however, Roland is seen as a cruel dictator, as he just cut down his main advisor in the middle of town. In Frederica's route, you go to protect the Roselles from the thieves, the same thieves who, just happened to steal specifically a book from the Frost archives that Frederica's mother sealed so that only Frederica could read it, which honestly is the biggest pile of coincidences ever, but sure, alright. The book reveals the supposed legend that the Roselle were trying to migrate to some holy land, that salt is spread everywhere across Norzelia, and that the Roselle were actually trying to spread salt to everybody, but Hyzant stole it and branded them as sinful people. The exact opposite of what the Hyzantian religion says. The proof is that the statue that all of the Hyzant worship actually houses the very same original giant salt crystal that the Roselle were trying to bring to everybody. Finally, in Benedict's route, you return back to the Wolford domain. Everyone celebrates Simone's recovery, which of course doesn't last very long, as he gets mortally wounded by Patriette's assassins. Before his death, he asks everyone except Benedict, himself, and Serenoa to leave. After everyone vacates, Simone reveals the secret of Serenoa's birth, that Serenoa is not Simone's child, but he is actually adopted. Specifically, Serenoa is King Regna's child born to a commoner woman, thereby making him Roland's older brother, as well as giving him claim to the throne. He passes along the royal signet that only those of the Glenbrook royal family may wear before passing away. Benedict is understandably outraged, as the lord and master he has dedicated everything to has just been killed, not even due to enemies from another kingdom, but due to the machinations of nobles from the very kingdom they serve. He offers his plan to pretty much usurp the throne from Roland, which wouldn't be very hard considering how much everyone is supporting House Wolfort, but Serenoa refuses because he's a nice guy like that. Anywho, everyone meets back up and goes back to the mines since Frost sent a bunch of soldiers over there. At the mines, they discover them trying to blow it up, which everyone manages to stop. In the mines, you finally find out why exactly Frost decided to take over Glenbrook and go to war with Hyzant, as inside of the mines are the fabled salt crystals, just like how Frederica Mutters said existed. This salt discovery brings us to the finale, as finally Serenoa and the rest of the game are out of time. As they have discovered this salt mine, there is no doubt that Hyzant also knows of it as well, and considering their entire religion is based on a lie, they're probably gonna send a humongous army to make sure that this discovery is never revealed. After everything Glenbrook has gone through, it's doubtful whether it can really survive now that it's in shambles, especially since Roland has just murdered the corrupt leadership that was left. And now that Frost has declared all-out war against both nations, it's clear that conflict is unavoidable. What I really like about the final route split is that, like previous decisions, you can clearly understand why each route leader is standing by whatever path, and how each of the solutions comes with its own share of problems. Benedict proposes an alliance with Frost to take down Hyzant, which is the most practical solution, but which Roland is understandably not down with, as Gustave just murdered his entire family. Luckily, with Serenoa's claim to the throne, he could probably oust Roland, but it would involve regicide and would most likely result in Glenbrook being subservient to Frost. Considering Gustave is a power-hungry maniac though, and that Frost's liberty policy completely disregards the weaker people, a vast majority of the population would suffer in the future, but as one of the stronger houses, Wolfort would survive and perhaps even thrive. As Benedict has just seen Simone Wolfort die at the hands of the Glenbrook nobles, it's also highly likely that he holds the current Glenbrook in contempt. And therefore also probably Roland, who wasn't able to control the nobles who performed such an act. While Benedict's plan is the safest one with the highest number of sacrifices, Frederica's plan is once again on the other side of the spectrum, where she proposes to sneak in and liberate all of the Roselles who are held captive in Hyzant, revealing the truth to both raise their spirits and throw all of Hyzant into chaos. After liberating the Roselle, they'll set off to Centralia, the promised land of her people that her mother wrote about in the book, away from Hyzant's evil hands. While all of this sounds like the good and moral thing to do, the actual conclusion to her plan is once again incredibly sloppy. For one, it completely disregards the citizens of Glenbrook and even the Wolfort domain. Frederica says that everyone will set out for Centralia with the Roselle, but aside from the fact that we don't even know if it actually exists, how would Serenoa and Roland convince anyone to join them on this fool's errand? 2, even if Centralia exists, was to stop Hyzant from just killing everybody at Centralia. Unless Centralia is like some lost city of Atlantis with super technology, they would pretty much just be handing themselves on a silver platter and only prolonging the inevitable culling. As bad as the plan is, however, it's really easy to understand Frederica's stance on it and why she proposes it. Her entire race is being used as a scapegoat for no other reason than it was convenient, and she just wants her people to be freed from the endless torment they suffered for no good reason. Finally, there's Roland's plan, which is essentially to surrender the crystals and submit to Hyzant. Glenbrook would adopt Hyzant's salt religion, the nobility will be entirely disbanded, and everyone will live under the church doctrine, even if it means that the Roselle will forever be exploited. While it's an incredibly terrible plan, because Hyzant is obviously the biggest and evilest church out there exploiting people, it's also a plan that you can completely understand why King Roland would put forth. Prince Roland, the upholder of justice who want to help people, probably would have submitted to Hyzant. But King Roland, who has just been bombarded with resentment from all sides, and who has just realized how much of a wreck Glenbrook truly is at a foundation level, it's pretty easy to see why he would want to let go of his kingly duties. All his life, he has been told that he isn't fit for the throne, and even once he has attained that throne, he is seemingly unable to change anything. With that said, his plan is terrible in the same way that Benedict's plan is terrible, because the nation they are placing their faith in is also flawed to its core. Hyzant functions by exploiting the Roselle, and by removing anyone disloyal to them on the premise of a religion that is altered to suit their needs at any time. With the need for more resources and more people for the church to support, what's to stop them from choosing more and more groups to exploit on the basis of whatever the top brass feels like doing? It's obvious the so-called Hierophant doesn't actually exist, and that the old man who's her voice is the one actually in charge. But even if he passes away, he'll just appoint another person to control everybody. All three of these routes are deeply flawed in the same way that just one of these moral convictions are deeply flawed on its own. Luckily for us, since we chose the correct decision at certain points in the game, and learned all of the important information, we get access to the golden ending, a solution that Serenoa finds without being forced to sacrifice any one side. Aside from liking golden endings as a concept, in my opinion, a golden ending is only as good as how well thought out the alternate routes are, as the golden ending, in a sense, acts as the culmination of all of those other routes. A bad golden ending can feel incredibly hackneyed, like a conclusion that seems to be pulled out of absolutely nowhere for the sake of giving a happy ending to a story. But a good golden ending gives the player a triumphant feeling of finding one solution to what seems like an impossible task, of finding an answer that answers every question without fail. An ending that's amazing because we've seen the paths that each character was forced to take in an alternate universe where perhaps they didn't succeed. What's great about Triangle Strategy's golden ending is that you didn't need to actually experience every other ending in order to truly appreciate it. While yes, there are some things that players wouldn't know without having played them, like for instance, that Serenoa in Frederica's route ends up sacrificing himself so that the Roselle can get away, or that Roland leaves in Benedict's route. Ultimately though, none of these are important. What is important is that the game has set up the foundation of the story well enough that we can understand what would generally happen to the future of Norzelia in each of these what-if scenarios. What's also great about the golden ending is that it's only achievable by the results the players themselves have discovered throughout the choices they have made, in a mostly reasonable fashion. In this ending, Serenoa takes all the information learned throughout the journey in order to find a path that will resolve all of the main character's worries. He remembers the fire traps that he somehow did need to use during Avlora's initial assault, which can now be used to hold back the Hyzant army. He remembers the alliance formed between Roland and Savrog, Dragon's dad, which can be used to convince Esfrost to help them without relying on the clearly power-hungry Gustadolf. Finally, he has explosions and information on the secret of the goddess statue, which can be used to reveal Hyzant's lie to the world, and free the Roselle, while simultaneously throwing Hyzant into chaos. At this point, after learning of Serenoa's plan, all three leaders who would normally be opposed to each other all agreed to work together on this insane solution that Serenoa managed to find. Benedict prepares the town once again for their last stand defense against the incoming Hyzant army to prevent the salt crystals from falling into their hands. Roland agrees to put aside his hatred of Esfrost for the greater good of freeing Norzelia from the evil Salt Church, as he sets out towards Savrog. Finally, Frederica sets out to bomb the giant goddess statue in the middle of town, revealing the church's lies for everyone to see with the aid of the neutral consortium that Serenoa managed to convince. On a side note, I find this part to be the hardest in the entire game, mostly since you are forced to split up your army into 3 distinct parties, when I only trained 1 actual party like most people do, so I was left with only 1/3 of my party trained for each part. Still, at least it ended up making for some incredibly creative party compositions. The rest of the story goes about as you might imagine. Benedict successfully sends the incoming Heisen army packing. I was pretty surprised by Roland actually trying to negotiate with Gustadolf as opposed to sticking a sword in him, considering how much he actively hates him, but Savrog breaks out of prison anyway, so they work together to take him down. Finally, the captive Roselle joined the uprising once Frederica and Serenoa blow up the goddess statue. This then leads into a big war as Serenoa and everyone else buy time for Savrog to set up the giant weapon Death Knell to blow up the wall, sending all of Heisen into a complete panic. After being the second to last of the Saintly Seven, you reach the Hierophant, who you find out is just a doll. What a surprise. Idore then reveals that he is the true puppet master, and then he takes some sort of drug that will give him eternal life and superpowers because, yeah, sure, I guess. It's kind of dumb, but it's also just kind of a make the whole final boss more exciting sort of thing. The finale against Idore wouldn't be that interesting if he was just the same tiny old man sprite he's been the entire game. This then leads into the happy ending where everyone finally celebrates Serenoa and Frederica's marriage that has been a long time awaiting. If I had to sum up what was Triangle Strategy's greatest strength when it comes to the story, I would say it's the setup. The story itself isn't full of any crazy twists or anything. Most of the major plot points you could probably see coming a mile away, like the fact that the Hierophant is just a doll that is being controlled by Idore, or that S-Frost is gonna sack Glenbrook, and that King Regna, Simone, and Maxwell are all gonna get ejected from the story. Anytime there is a church in a story and the Pope is never shown doing anything, it's usually because they don't really exist. And S-Frost was almost comically evil aside from Avlora from the get-go. What Triangle Strategy does really well, however, is establishing the setting that this entire story takes place in. All 3 nations of Norzelia and every single faction that exists in each one of these nations are each given their own respective amount of time. By delving deep into each group's motivations and goals, it gives the player an understanding of how every nation functions. People on every side react in realistic ways to the coming conflict, whether that be through securing their own interests or exploiting others. For lack of a better word, the struggle that Serenoa faces feels very real because of how grounded the world of Norzelia feels, which is kind of an amazing feat when you consider that this is the very same world where people are literally casting magic. In a web of conspiracies and power struggles, how will Serenoa and his friends fix what seems to be a problem far beyond just beating up the bad guy is a really enticing story hook. For the most part, I don't think there was any real moment that felt really contrived, aside from the bandits getting the book to Frederica from S-Frost, which is probably kind of a stretch, and Idore going Immortal God mode near the very end, but the latter obviously only exists to give the player an actual final boss. After the story gets going and we pass the obvious beginning of S-Frost sacking Glenbrook, I was always at the edge of my seat wondering where the plot was gonna go next. A lot of games try to tell a good vs evil story, but Triangle Strategy truly captures a desperate struggle in much more nuance than others. It also makes political struggles in a JRPG really exciting, which now that is truly a rarity. If you got anything you'd like to add about the story, what you thought about it, who's your favorite character, or other such things, feel free to tell me about it in the comments section. Otherwise, all supporter stuff is in the same place as always, like, subscribe, notifications, and with that, I'll see you later, till next time.